Okay. Hello, everybody. We'll go right ahead and jump into our next presentation we have here. We have the honor of Dr. Anna Grigorian presenting today. She has broad experience working in mental health settings, providing school-based counseling services, neuropsychological assessment, and psychotherapy. Her clinical work and research focus on children, parents, and teachers, and she's developed and executed bullying prevention and mental health focused programming geared toward elementary and middle school students and their parents. Anna is currently an assistant professor of psychology and serves as co-director of clinical training for the MS Counseling Psychology program at California Baptist University. Anna, thank you so much for coming on tonight and speaking on the topic of children and mental health. And everybody who has joined us live on Facebook, feel free to type in any questions you might have. And at the end of Dr. Grigorian's presentation, we'll have a Q&A. All right, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and be able to share this topic with everybody, especially because yesterday was World Children's Day. This seems really timely. And additionally, because we continue to have in the news incidents of bullying and serious injury and sometimes death due to bullying. So I think this is a topic that we can't speak enough about, that we should be shouting from the rooftops about, and really getting everybody involved. Today, my focus is going to be teachers, but I know there are people out there doing amazing work related to cyberbullying, related to interventions that parents can be doing. But today we'll be focusing specifically on the role of teachers related to bullying prevention. We'll talk about the historical background of bullying, how we define it, its prevalence, the impact it has on children, and then get into talking about the role of teachers. So the term bullying has really evolved over time. It used to mean something along the lines of outstanding or accomplished, and some of our listeners might know the term bully for you, and that was really intended as a positive thing. However, it has over time transformed, as words and language often does, to mean someone who is a harasser. It's interesting because this term really isn't new, but it's difficult when we try to do research into the historical background of this phenomenon. Because the word has changed so much, it's really difficult to pin down when it really started to be seen as a problem. But what we know is that there is reference to interpersonal aggression in the Bible. We find many negative experiences and harassment in peer-to-peer conflict in Greco-Roman peer relationships in writings from antiquity. And we see a lot of incidents in the 19th century, which is really when we start to see bullying, that term, being used in the way that we know it today. It eventually became used publicly for the very first time in the description of the death of a soldier due to systematic bullying in the military. Generally, however, even though we can't find the same term, and we look at kind of adjacent terms or descriptions of experiences that might be interpreted as having been bullying or having the same type of impact, we begin to see that bullying is typically viewed as kind of a rite of passage, as a normative part of childhood, as something everybody goes through. And often kind of the view is that it makes you stronger, it's good for you, right? It toughens you up. But it really became a problem and started to be viewed as a major problem that needed intervention in the 1960s and 70s in Sweden, when in response to a phenomenon called mobbing in Sweden, Dan Olweus developed his now very famous intervention for bullying and bullying prevention program, which many people might know. How we define bullying is very specific, and that definition, as I mentioned, has grown over time. It's defined in the academic literature as consisting of intentional, repeated, unwanted behavior, which includes an imbalance of power between the bully and the victim or the target. To fully understand the concept, a number of studies have focused on the definition and have really categorized it as being very distinct from teasing in the intent. We often hear people talking about bullying as being a form of teasing or just being teasing. But in teasing, there's kind of an intended playfulness, kind of both people are in on it, right? In bullying, in the most current academic literature, we're seeing as non-consensual, meaning that there's an inherent intent to harass, to inflict harm. There's aggression involved. And bullying is also distinct from being rude or being mean behavior, particularly when we talk about it with younger children who sometimes don't see the difference. Bullying is not, and sometimes it's easier to define things as what they are not, right? Bullying is not a disagreement, an argument, or a fight. It is not accidental. It is not an isolated incident. And it is not that mutual horseplay or teasing. It's also really distinct from the concepts of aggression and fighting. Whereas aggression is kind of a broad term for hostile behaviors and attitudes, not all aggression is necessarily bullying, because aggression might be, for example, an isolated incident or part of a disagreement or an argument. Bullying, however, is something that is repeated, and it is very intentional, and it happens over and over again. Fighting also is different from bullying in that fighting is a physical altercation. It's important to keep in mind that fighting is actually often culturally congruent, especially for males. Fighting is also inherently an aggressive act, but not all fighting is bullying, because again, it might be an isolated incident, or it might be as part of an argument or fight. But what we're looking for in order to be able to understand and define bullying specifically is that it is intentional, unwanted, and non-consensual, repeated, and includes that balance of power. Now, fighting can be part of bullying because it can be part of this physical types of bullying, but there's certainly much more to bullying than just physical aggression. So all in all bullying involves aggression. Some bullying might involve fighting. So one thing to keep in mind, however, is that because fighting is typically seen as more acceptable and is experienced as less shameful necessarily, children, especially young boys, might feel that it is more acceptable to identify a situation as fighting rather than having been bullied. So there might be a certain underreporting of bullying incidents in some research. Notably, in one survey done in a lot of countries in the Caucasus, found that Armenia had the lowest incidence of bullying, but one of the highest incidences of fighting. So it begs the question of how that's being defined, not by the researchers necessarily, but by the people actually experiencing it. So it's really up to authority figures, teachers, parents, school officials, those in power, to apply the definition and teach the definition and raise awareness about what bullying is, and then to determine how best to intervene that's culturally appropriate. To talk about for a moment prevalence, we want to look at the prevalence in the United States, and also I'll be looking at the prevalence in Armenia, since our audience is either Armenian or interested in Armenian affairs. So in the United States, we have found that about 20% of US students over the age of 12 or over, report being bullied. Rates tend to vary due to differing samples in the studies, but some studies suggest rates as high as 73%. So while 20% may not look like a huge number, we want to keep in mind that that 20% represents children who are being harmed. 30% of young people admit to bullying others in the survey. 70.6% of young people say they have seen bullying in their schools. 15 to 16.5% of bullied youth report experiencing cyberbullying. So while I'm not focusing on cyberbullying specifically in this talk, it is something definitely to keep in mind as an area of research. And there are many organizations and researchers focusing specifically on that. And kind of a staggering statistic is that 160,000 students reportedly skip school every day due to bullying. That is so many children missing out on vital information, missing out on learning, missing out on social interactions. So that's something that we want to keep in mind when we think about the importance of this topic and how we might intervene, and why the focus is on teachers. The prevalence in Armenia is no less staggering. Research conducted through Arab Care Medical Center on the health behavior in school-aged children found that 12% of boys and 10% of girls ages 11 to 15 reported being bullied during the past 2 months. Interestingly, in rural areas, the rates were higher for boys, and in Yerevan, the rates were actually higher for girls. 16% of boys and 10% of girls of the same age reported having bullied another child in the past 2 months. 8% of boys and 5% of girls reported having been cyberbullied. And 10% of boys and 8% of girls reported having skipped school at least once last year due to bullying. Interestingly, when we compare this to data from 2013 and 2014, rates have actually nearly doubled. So, we want to think about whether or not this is really an increase in bullying, which it may be, or it might actually be an indication of the increase due to more awareness, better definitions, and really starting to have kind of an impact culturally in recognizing this as a problem. The area I really want to focus on is that how many kids are skipping school, both in the US and in Armenia, because those are children who are deprived of educational opportunities. And when we look at who is targeted by bullying, we find that overall it's anybody who has a perceived difference or a weakness that is targeted by perpetrators of bullying. Research has identified stigmatized identities as risk factors for bullying, and has found that children new to a community, children with disabilities, with mental health disorders, children identifying as LGBTQ report more experiences with bullying than do other children. Targeting of stigmatized identities, which are additionally frequently targets of oppression outside of school, make the case that bullying is not just a matter of peer conflict, but it's also a larger systemic issue and a cultural issue requiring a new lens and a new approach and much more awareness. Bullying impacts both the...
We have 5 more minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. So bullying impacts both the victims and the perpetrators. And as I mentioned, the fact that so many children skip school or are anxious at school and unable to learn really makes this a social justice issue, because it prevent students from having an equal access to education. And that's really where teachers are involved. The field of education has long integrated social justice into research and practices. The role of teachers in social justice issues is not a new idea. They've worked to establish many initiatives that aid students that are in their care. And we see this also in the implementation of bullying programs at schools. However, when we look at the effectiveness of these programs, we find some mixed results. And specifically for Armenia, these programs are fairly new, so we don't have a great amount of data yet to go on to see how effective they are. It's often more useful to look at components of successful programs, which include parent and teacher training, rewarding pro-social behavior, engagement of bystanders. And we really find that teacher involvement reduces bullying. So that is one thing that has been well established. What we find is that there are fewer bullying instances and incidents when there are positive teacher relationships between teachers and students, when students feel like the teachers care about them, teachers listen to them, and are willing to be involved. That teacher involvement is actually the preferred method of intervention according to middle school students. They don't want administrators involved. They don't want parents involved. They really want teachers involved. And we see and we find lowest levels of bullying when teachers are perceived by students to be highly effective and have to exert little effort. So when a teacher comes across as really needing to work extra hard to figure out, well, what do I do in this bullying situation? How do I help the students? Then the students don't really feel connected and they don't feel like that person can help. So having that additional training and really teachers taking the initiative to learn these programs and implement them is really what makes such a big difference in reducing bullying in schools. We also see that being consistent in their response to bullying incidents is also a big factor in reducing bullying, because sometimes responding, sometimes not responding, or administering consequences differently kind of undercuts and undermines the efforts that the teachers are trying to make. What research has found are effective teacher actions is improved supervision, consistent disciplinary action, not necessarily punishment, but some kind of involvement, consistent classroom rules that are specific to how they plan to respond to bullying incidents, uses of videos in teaching bullying prevention or teaching lessons and just engaging with students, and the intensity and duration of programs implemented at the school. So if there's a program but the teachers aren't really using it, or it's only used for a short amount of time, and those things aren't as helpful as kind of targeted specific and consistent programs and interventions for teachers. What teachers can do is promote pro-social behavior. They can focus on empathy as part of the school culture, starting with the classroom and expanding out. Teachers can monitor these unowned spaces, so places that maybe during lunch or during recess or during PE or passing periods tend to be hotspots for bullying. Teachers kind of walking around and being present, it shows that this reduces rates of bullying. Establishing firm classroom policies and responding consistently, as I mentioned. Helping to implement or establish school-wide long-lasting intensive programs, because teachers are really on the front lines of doing this work. So while it would be lovely for administration to be the initiators of it, having teachers who can start the programs and implement them is helpful. Very important is teachers encouraging students to understand and appreciate diversity, since we talked about those risk factors, fostering an atmosphere of inclusion and representation in the classroom, whether that's through sharing diverse points of view, utilizing materials that include people from different backgrounds with different abilities, and really exploring those different stories and experiences helps students know one another, helps them have cross-cultural experiences, and reduces the likelihood of targeting somebody, because it's much harder to target someone who you see a connection with. Teachers can also build an awareness and understanding of injustice by weaving discussions about bullying and oppression into the curriculum. And they can help students who are having a hard time adjusting or finding friends, whether that's through facilitating friendships or providing jobs for students in the classroom to do. One of the things that teachers are so excellent at is finding ways to help students connect with one another. And that goes a long, long way to reducing bullying. So with that, I will open it up to questions. Hopefully I made it. I know that was more than 5 minutes. I'm sorry about that. But hopefully if there are any questions, I can answer those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grigorian. And it's great that you pointed out the exact definition of bullying and the different, aspects of it being intentional, being unwanted, being repeated, and there being an imbalance of power, right? And how aggression is always part of bullying, and the difference between that and fighting and bullying. The importance of underreporting, right? A lot of kids in Armenia and here are underreporting bullying, and the power that teachers have, the different things they can do to help support these kids and set sort of a very good environment for them to foster healthy connection. So we have a couple questions that I want to ask you, and we have them on our Facebook Live. And please, everybody, I encourage you to put down your questions in our Facebook Live, and we'll be sure to answer them. One question is that, are there any negative effects on children who witness other kids being bullied? So, for example, their friends. Is there some sort of vicarious trauma, vicariously being bullied themselves? If you can address that, please.
Yes, absolutely. I didn't get into it in this presentation, but there's a whole body of literature on the negative impacts on bystanders. So as bystanders are one of the best ways to intervene in bullying, because kind of the idea of safety in numbers, those children who witness bullying tend to have higher rates of anxiety and depression. So they are also negatively impacted by seeing that.
Yeah, thank you. The next question we have is, how about the scenarios where the teachers are themselves perpetuating the bullying due to their own implicit or explicit biases towards certain groups?
Mhm. Um, uh, One of the things that we have to remember is that when we talk about the role of teachers, they are not, some kind of ephemeral being that is above human experiences. Have also come from family backgrounds that maybe normalize bullying. They have had bullying experiences themselves. They may have, been perpetrators of bullying in childhood. So it's really important that we remember that many of our teachers might be coming in with this mindset of bullying being a rite of passage and normative. So in any kind of intervention and any kind of program, it really needs to start with raising awareness and education for teachers. So programs can't just focus on the children by saying, things like, don't do bullying, or here's how you stop it, this is what you do when you see it happen. It really needs to take a whole school approach, and for best results, the academic literature time and again points to the involvement not just of teachers and students, but also the administration, the parents, and the community. Because if everybody is operating from the same understanding of what bullying is, how it's defined, and its harmful effects on everybody involved, then there's less likely to be a scenario where the teachers are perpetrating the bullying, or are normalizing it, or are brushing it off.
Thank you so much. I currently do not see any more questions, but I do want to encourage everyone who's with us on Facebook Live to share your questions. And if we don't get to answer them now, you can become a member of AAMHA, the Armenian-American Mental Health Association. You can follow us on our social media, on our Facebook and Instagram, and we'll have many more opportunities to hear great speakers come on. Thank you so much, Dr. Grigorian. It was lovely having you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Mary Panosian. I'm very excited to hear her present today. Dr. Mary Panosian is a licensed clinical psychologist. She has had extensive training and clinical experience working with children, adolescents, and adults. She is passionate about working with individuals from different cultural backgrounds and has clinical experience working with a broad range of clinical issues, including depression, anxiety, trauma, ADHD, and mood. Throughout her education and clinical work, Dr. Panosian has done research on the impact of shame, particularly in the Armenian-American community, and the influence of cultural issues. Thank you so much, Dr. Panosian, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm happy to be here and talk about this topic. Should I get started? Are we?
Go for it. Go for it. Anybody that has any questions, again, feel free to post them in our chat on Facebook Live.
So I decided to do this topic for this was actually my dissertation topic on the impact of shame on first generation Armenian-American adolescents. And for a long time, I joked that, like, during grad school, I joked that it was like my memoirs, because I feel I was a first generation Armenian-American adolescent, and a lot of my friends also had experiences of their parents throwing around the word "amot." It's very common in our society and our culture to use that word as kind of getting kids in line. So in grad school, we've talked about shame, and we kind of went over the negative impacts of shame, but not in regard to the Armenian-American community. So I wanted to look into that gap in research, particularly because I would imagine that the experience of acculturation would influence the experience and the impact of shame. So I think in order to kind of, like I said, there was a gap in research. So in order to look into this topic, I kind of had to look into various different things and tie it together. So bear with me. I'm going to start with just talking about shame. So to define shame, shame is a negative emotion that encompasses an experience of feeling unworthy, undesirable, and self-critical. It relates to how individuals perceive themselves to exist in the minds of other people. It can lead people into becoming overly self-evaluative and self-critical as a protective step. Shame can also include feelings of inferiority and self-consciousness stemming from a need to hide potential deficiencies of the self. So kind of along the lines of thinking, I must be inferior as I have so many flaws that I need to hide. The development of shame begins around the age of 18 months. So I think many parents might not realize that by the age of 3, children are able to experience shame. They're able to view and perceive themselves in relation to others and their surroundings. At that age, children are governed by the right hemisphere, which is very globally focused, rather than having a narrow lens, a more focused lens. So they're able to look at their role in society, and they have self-awareness, and they have the capability of making these self-attributions on a global level. So basically evaluating themselves and their societal presence, how others might be thinking of them, and if they're violating any social rules or standards. The role of shame is to motivate efforts to better the self, act in more socially acceptable ways. So it notifies us when there are potential social violations or boundaries being crossed in social settings. It gives us feedback on our worth and our social rank in a group. It also highlights any incongruencies between our ideal self versus our actual self. So the person that we want to be versus how we are coming across based off of our behavior. And shame without any coping skills. I mean, so with all that being said, shame is not inherently bad. It exists for a reason. It motivates us in a social way, and it serves a purpose just like any emotion. But shame without any coping skills and shame at a higher frequency and without any confidence and a secure sense of self can lead to a downgrading of the self-identity. So lower value of the self and feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. I think something I really wanted to touch on, and I pretty much talk about this with my clients all the time as well, is the difference between shame and guilt. They're used interchangeably, but they have distinct differences in impact. So shame focuses on the entire self, your identity. It alters the person's view of who they are and what their value is, while guilt focuses on a specific action or a behavior. So when you feel guilty about something that you did, you feel bad that you made that choice or you made that mistake. When you feel shame for something that you did, you feel bad for who you are. You start to feel as though the person that you are is flawed. Guilt, it comes with that tension, discomfort, and it works to motivate the person to repair relationships or fix that choice that they made or that mistake that they made. Whereas shame becomes a reflection of a flawed self. And so it creates this negative self-perception, and then it leads to feelings of worthlessness and powerlessness. Again, shame in and of itself does not necessarily lead to these negative outcomes in this intensity, but I think the more you experience a certain feeling, the more you develop schemas and dispositions based off of that emotion. So the more you feel shame, the less value you feel off of your self-identity, your identity as a person. Shame, a lot of research has shown that shame can lead to depression and anxiety. It leads individuals to look inward and judge the entire self in light of a negative situation. It causes people to focus on their flaws and their lack of control. It also has led to aggressive behavior. So there's such thing called shame rage, which is a response to shame rather than looking inward. It brings about defensiveness and frustration. It leads individuals to protect the self by shifting the responsibility. So looking outward and blaming others for that thing or for that feeling of worthlessness that one is feeling. So it can lead to hostility and aggression. And I think it was interesting for me looking in the research to see that shame can lead to trauma. So it can feel so intense that it can have the same impact as a traumatic event, and it leads to these traumatic memories that become reference points, which then assign meaning to the future situations that we'll be in and future relationships that we have. I want to preface this, I want to just add a disclaimer that a lot of this research on the impact of shame was done on Western societies. And so that brings me to kind of tying in the focus of my dissertation, which was bringing in, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but the Armenian-American community. Before I do that, I want to just talk briefly about different parenting styles. Because shame can be used as a parenting tool. And there are certain parenting styles that have the ability to change children's views of themselves, and they have an impact on the intensity of shame that children can feel. So Bumrand had 4 classifications of parenting. The first is authoritative, which is a demanding parenting style, but it's also responsive and warm. The parent provides discipline, but also is very supportive. Authoritarian parenting is demanding, but not responsive. So it focuses a lot on obedience and structure and status over warmth and understanding. A permissive parenting style is responsive and supportive while not demanding. So there's not a lot of discipline. There's much more focus on warmth and leniency and nurture. And neglecting is neither responsive nor demanding. It's just when the parents kind of checked out, they're not really providing much for the children. Out of these 4, the one I'm going to focus on is authoritarian parenting, because it's the one that most relates to the development of a shame-prone personality. It's highly focused on negatives. It reflects negative attitude towards the child, and it points out failures, whether implicitly or explicitly. The second part of my research went into different family styles. So there are some family styles that are more shame-prone and more prone to using parenting styles that incorporate more shame. Before I talk about it, I would like to define individualism and collectivism, because that's really going to encompass the different family styles I talk about. So individualism, individualistic societies, that would be your Western society. That would be basically what America is. So they value personal choice. They value a healthy self-esteem, intrinsic motivation, so an internal drive to succeed at your goals. A big focus on self-maximization, so achieving one's full potential as an individual. The individualism really centers around independence, autonomy, and your personal goals. In contrast, collectivism values a connection to the family and other close relationships, so not just immediate relationships, but extended family, friendships, relationships, the community as a whole. Individuals view themselves as an extension of the family, and there's a lot of emphasis on the well-being of the community. And so your actions are not just your actions reflect the entire group. There's a big focus on respect for elders and obedience. And so everything you do it has an impact on the reputation of the community and the group. And rather than pursuing your individual goals, your goals are kind of, because they represent the group, you're basically keeping in mind what the goals of your parents, the other relationships in your family, what they would want for you when you're making these choices. Armenians have a collectivistic culture. We are very much connected to the family, the well-being of the community. And so when immigrating to America, the motivation to maintain our ethnic culture despite having to assimilate is high. And there was some research going into, our history, the Armenian genocide. I did find a couple articles, some research about kind of shame being passed down generations from having survived genocide. There wasn't a lot though, so I haven't really included in this presentation. But I think, it kind of we have a good idea of why Armenians would be so motivated to maintain their ethnic culture, despite having to immigrate. So, like I said, Armenians are often attempting to sustain the values and traditions of their origin culture, especially when it contrasts so much from the values of the dominant group. There is a difference, though, between immigrants and native-born. Native-born are individuals who are born in America to immigrant parents, and that's basically what I use that interchangeably with first generation. So first generation individuals are more susceptible to the identity and the culture of the majority. So Armenians are immigrating here and they're trying to maintain their culture. They use a very authoritarian parenting style. That doesn't change. They teach their children to obey and respect elders. They teach their children to attend to the needs of others before themselves. They're very motivated to remain loyal to their community and their in-group, despite being part of a diaspora and being in America. One thing I want to note at this point is that this type of parenting style does not necessarily lead to maladaptive consequences. So there were studies that showed that authoritarian parenting in non-Anglo cultural groups doesn't necessarily have these bad consequences. It doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of shame and depression and anxiety and so forth. In communities where it's considered the norm, it's very much related to caring. That's how children expect their parents to show love. That's how children expect their parents to show that they care for them. These studies were done in places like Japan, Korea, and Turkey, where lower levels of warmth and affection are expected. When children see this type of parenting as normal, they don't necessarily feel rejected by their parents. And so in Armenia, it might necessarily have the same impact as it would here. But the reason I wanted to look into it is because when you're adding immigration and acculturation, certain aspects of that authoritarian parenting could have different outcomes, because now it's not necessarily the norm. The majority society functions very differently. And so these kids are seeing all of this, and it can lead to very different outcomes. So these first generation adolescents are surrounded by their individualistic peers who are encouraged to be independent, build boundaries, focus on their individual goals. Not only are they hearing this from their friends at school, but I know a lot of kids might be like, I mean, in Glendale, there's not that much, there's a lot of Armenian community around. But they're seeing it, sorry, I heard myself for a second, but they're seeing it on TV, on TikTok, on Instagram, like they're seeing it everywhere. So even though they're expected to make decisions with parents, they're expected to be in tune with the family's needs and pursue the goals that will best benefit the reputation of their family, also being impacted by individualistic society as the majority society and the impact of that. And so they're expected to really balance all of this, which can be alienating. It's like, which way do you go? You go one way, you feel shamed by your family. You go the other way, you feel alienated by the community. And so it's really difficult to integrate smoothly. It can lead to conflict in the home, inner turmoil for adolescents. It can lead to shame within the community, as group harmony is so highly valued. And then it can lead to the parent basically upping the ante and increasing their parenting style and increasing their authoritarian parenting and techniques, which would be increasing the frequency of feeling shame. And so while shame is not inherently leading to depression and anxiety, it's that frequency of shame that can lead to depression, anxiety, aggression, and trauma. And so it kind of puts you in that, when the parent is upping the ante and increasing the techniques, that's increasing the frequency of shame.
Dr.
Which, yeah.
We have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And so, yeah, so essentially it can lead to these detrimental consequences because of all of this. I think the takeaways of this and things that I've kind of used in my clinical work are that, both cultures have high points and ideals beneficial to well-being. It's not about kind of going one way or another, and it's going to be really hard for these adolescents to choose one or the other. They live here and they're going to be impacted by both societies, no matter what they do throughout life. So I think the most important thing, the key, is to balance the two worlds and working with the adolescents to kind of hold on to working with adolescents and their parents to kind of understand how all of this meshes together and figuring out ways that they can balance their two worlds and feel good about themselves at the same time. So I think that's actually it for me. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for talking about shame, and it's, it's so important to know that children experience shame from such an early age, and how shame has a purpose, and it can be, healthy if there is a healthy level of shame, and the importance of having coping skills around that. You also talked about the difference between shame and guilt, and how shame is really about who you are versus what you did, and how shame can be traumatic, right? That's so interesting to note. The different styles of parenting. I like how you talked about that, and how shame can be used as a tool of parenting. Yeah, and talking about authoritarian parenting and immigration, how that impacts shame in general. It's really interesting that you talked about the shame being the norm, or this type of parenting being the norm in one culture, and that might not necessarily be a traumatic thing or have a negative impact on kids. And how it's important to have that balance once it does come into families that have immigrated. So we have a couple of questions here. One is, you talked about how the research shows that it doesn't necessarily impact children negatively if that is the norm in their culture. Do you think that could that be sort of coming from a lack of awareness? Could that, be normalized and still have a negative impact subconsciously on those kids, even though it's the norm?
Well, I think that too much shame can have a negative impact regardless of the culture and the society that you grew up in, because of its just inherent impact on how you view yourself. And so even it being the norm, yeah, you expect, to be kind of chastised in some way or disciplined in this way. But too much of that will lead to that downgrading of the self-esteem and the self-identity, because it's so focused on who you are as a person versus the choices that you're making. So yes, I do think that I think it would be different levels because it's the norm. And so it's hard to say how much shame it would take to get to the level that, the research is showing here, the impacts that it's having. But I do think that ultimately, if it's frequent enough and intense enough, it can have detrimental consequences. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question is whether the parents' own level of, having shame or their own experiences with shame increase their strategy of, the likelihood of them using shame as a parenting strategy.
Absolutely. I think, I talked briefly about our history as Armenians, and I think my takeaway from that research was that so much of our parenting style and the way that we interact with each other is passed down generations. And so the generational trauma and the way that we've learned to interact with each other and the way that we've learned to interact with the world definitely gets passed down. So our parents are using the same strategies that their parents are using, and it works in the same environment that they were raised. I mean, as far as I haven't done this research in Armenia, but where we see the problem is now you take the parent out of the environment where they were raised and you're doing the same thing, but the kids here are seeing different things. It's not their norm anymore. So yes, I think I went off on tangent a little bit, but yes, it does definitely impact the way that they parent, having been shamed themselves.
Yeah, thank you. And one last comment, and I'm curious to hear your take on this as well, is within the Armenian culture, many parents view their children as an extension of themselves, hence a challenge to really embracing the individuality of the child. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think it is very much part of the collectivistic values, right? We're all kind of reflections of each other. There is not really that concept of the person as an individual. It's you are part of this family and we are one. So I agree with that comment. I can definitely see that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Panosian. It's been lovely hearing you.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to end this live, and in a few minutes we have another topic about another session and speakers on couples and families. So the live is going to end, but we have another live coming on, so anybody that wants to join on that, please feel free to go on our page and join that live. Thank you all so much.